MiG-21 is a Soviet Tier 6 fighter. It's regarded as one of the best dogfighters in their tier, but to understand why people think so, we must first take a look at its performance. So what is the performance like? Well, for this tier it's actually pretty good, having a decent top speed and decent stall speed. On the other hand, the optimal speed is not so optimal because of your delta wing, which makes you bleed a lot of speed, making it almost impossible to win any sustained turn fight. The energy bleed is even more noticeable if your plane is completely stock, so I highly recommend that you upgrade the engine and wings if you want to do well in this plane. The decent thrust to weight ratio allows you to somewhat quickly regain your energy after a prolonged dogfight. However, I suggest you avoid prolonged dogfights at all costs, as this plane shines in one circle turns. If you maintain your optimal, you will have one of the best turn rates in this tier. And finally, the roll rate. It's not the best, but it's not the worst. I'm sure you won't have any problems with it. Moving on to its offensive armament. For the gun, you get the 23mm GSH-23L with 250 rounds when maxed. This is a decent amount, but thanks to your high rate of fire, you might have some problems with it, especially if your aim is not that great. Learning trigger patience is very important if you want to get multiple kills without having to rearm at your airbase. You get a decent selection of missiles, 3 infrared missiles and 1 semi-active radar homing missile. I'll cover each one in more detail shortly, but before I do that, I'll quickly mention the countermeasures, which you get a total of 58, 40 flares and 18 chaff. You drop 1 flare and 1 chaff at a time, meaning sometimes you'll run out of chaff but still have some flares left. This isn't that much of an issue if you know how to dodge radar missiles without having to use chaff. The R3S is a Soviet reverse-engineered AIM-9B and is this plane's stock infrared missile. It's only able to lock targets from behind and it gets easily outturned. That's because of the low max G pool of only 10 Gs. This missile lacks a gimbal, which requires you to be somewhat aligned with the enemy if you want to get a lock and eventually fire it. It's also not radar assisted, further limiting its launch capabilities. One of the positives of this missile is that it's relatively light, so it won't affect your performance too much. The range is obviously not the best. If you don't want the enemy to outrun it, you should fire it no further than 2 km. Also don't fire it at targets that are maneuvering a lot and are actively looking around themselves and, of course, flaring. Overall, a very basic missile that I highly recommend you replace with a better one. The R60 is the second infrared missile you can purchase for the MiG-21. Just like the R3S, it can only be fired from your aspect. With a max G pool of 30 Gs, the R60 should have no problems pulling into the target unless the missile was fired from too close. It also shouldn't be fired from too far away, as the range is not the greatest. I recommend that you fire it from a maximum distance of little over 2 km. It's also very flare hungry. One flare in its seeker and it's gone. You can also perform radar assisted launches. However, the enemy needs to be inside the missile's gimbal, which isn't as large as the radar search cone. The R60 is very light. You can carry 6 of them and you won't really notice any difference in your performance. Overall, a decent missile that's worth buying. The best infrared missile you can purchase for the MiG-21 is the R60M, an all-aspect heat-seeking missile. It's pretty similar to the R60, having the same max G-pool and field of view. The gimbal is almost doubled in size, allowing you to use the radar's full search cone for radar-assisted launches. I personally don't recommend hoverboard launches, especially if you're close to the enemy. You can get half a kilometer kills in rear aspect shots, but these only happen if both you and the enemy are slow and are somewhat aligned with each other. You can fire it from pretty close in head-ons if the enemy isn't pre-flaring. Any R60M that was fired from farther than 1.2 km has a pretty high chance of hitting. The flare resistance is also improved, but it's still easily flared. The range in rear aspect shots is the exact same as the one of the R60. Overall, a pretty good missile if used right. The only semi-active radar homing missile this plane can carry is the R3R, the radar version of the R3S. It's by far not the best radar missile of this tier, having a low max G pool and low range. I only used it a couple times and it got easily chaffed every time. I was able to get a couple kills when I fired it from less than 2 kilometers. If you decide to use it, only carry 1 or 2 and fire it in head-ons when you're close to the enemy. The enemy must not be moving at all, and if he's dropping chaff, don't even try launching one at him. Also don't fire it in side or rear aspect shots where it's chaffed the easiest. It's a nice missile to have if you're going against brain-dead players that fly in a straight line towards you in a head-on. Here's a couple recommended loadouts. The first one includes the stock missile, the second one includes either the R60 or the R60M, and the final one includes a mix of 2 radar and 4 ion missiles. The radar present on the MiG-21 is the RP-22. It's a pretty basic radar. Being a pure radar, it gets chaffed very easily. The range is not the best, but it's good enough for your R3R. The same can be said for the search cam. You only get access to one mode, SDT or hard lock, which pings the enemy's RWR and makes you only see the person you're locking. This plane gets the SPO-10 as its radar warning receiver. I think it's safe to say that this is the worst RWR in this game. You can only detect radar signals from 4 different directions, and you have to pay attention to see if any one of the circles is flashing faster than others. Here's a quick guide on its gameplay. You can pause the video to read the full text. Last thing I have to do is place the MiG-21 on this tier list. After gathering the thoughts of my community, I'll place it into S- tier. It has decent performance and decent missiles. The radar and RWR might be a bit lacking, but the positives outweigh the negatives.